What about Montana? Is it an activist state?
Well, Montana's a funny place because you think of it as being very conservative, and it can be. But they have this saying, at least with the electoral politics, that they say they send Republicans to Washington, but Democrats to Helena, which is the capital. And it has this kind of strange cultural divide between the eastern part and the western part of the state, but it's not like the coastal states where the population is centered on a certain city. It's more like the whole state is almost bisected. And there's a continental divide goes through Montana, which is where the Rocky Mountains kind of split where the rivers go. So on one side of it, the rivers go towards the east until they hit, all the way down to the East Coast or the Gulf of Mexico or, that side of the country. And then on the west side, they all go to the West Coast. And it's just, where the mountain range has some really high peaks. In fact, like having to go back and forth between where my mom's parents lived and where my parents grew up, and then where I grew up, we'd have to go over several mountain ranges to get there. But this one in particular, my mom had this theory, I don't know if it's true or not, but she used to say that the people on the west side were generally more progressive and kind of more open because during the pioneer days, the people who were too scared to go over the mountains stayed on the east side, and then the adventurers went on to the west side. I don't know if that's true or not, but it could also just be like the west kind of being closer to the coast and having more interaction with the cities on the coast, and the east kind of being more with connected to the Midwest, because Montana's so small, we don't even have professional sports teams. Like usually what happens is the people on the west side, when it comes to American football, will cheer for the Seattle Seahawks, and then the people on the east part of the state will cheer for the Denver Broncos.
But how far away are these distances? Like your town is on the east side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how far away is that from Denver? Like if you wanted to go to Denver to see a football game, how far would you have to travel?
Well, I don't know the mileage, but it's funny because in a place like Montana where everything's so far, we usually talk about things in terms of like driving time.
Yeah.
So it's a good 14, 15-hour drive. I mean, it's almost the same distance from Denver to Seattle from where I live, as far as driving time goes. Most people don't even go to these cities. Like where I grew up a little bit on both sides, actually. We moved around a lot because my dad went to different places for different job opportunities. I spent most of the time on the east side, but my parents are from the west side of the state. And where we ended up in the end was my mom ended up buying a farm on the east part because that's where she could kind of find the best property at the price range that she had, that had the best climate that she wanted and the type of soil that she was looking for. And the closest town is called Belfry, and it has a population of 210, or at least it did at the last census. And we always joke that they were counting the dogs too, because it really is just
210.
Really small.
I think that there's more people in my apartment building.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
I think half of my block has more people in it than Belfry, So we'd have to drive an hour to go grocery shopping, basically. We'd go up to Costco and load up the Suburban, this big SUV that my parents had. And that would be like our monthly purchases. So, you can't really imagine a more different place than Sao Paulo. When I would go out when I was younger, my parents would get worried if I didn't come back home at time, not because they were really worried about me driving drunk or anything, but because they're like, if I did have an accident, it could be hours and hours before anybody would even drive by. It's pretty isolated where they live. And my parents still live out there. They still have the farm. My sister lives out there with them too. And it's actually been a good thing right now with the whole pandemic and everything. But
it sounds really similar, kind of, to where my grandma lives in northern Idaho, which would be more similar to the western part of Montana, I think, because this area is more green and mountainous and has trees and forests, but it's still forever from anything. Like recently she's had some health problems and has to go to the hospital. And okay, the nearest town does have a hospital, but it's more like a clinic. They don't really have facilities there to do anything. So for her to go to a real hospital, she has to either go to Seattle or Portland, which is like 8, or if she's driving, because she's kind of crazy, it's a 6-hour drive.
Yeah. You know, fun fact. Go ahead. Sorry.
But that's still kind of like mind-blowing, I think, that there are people living all across the United States in these towns that are like half a day's travel from a real hospital.
Yeah. I mean, for somebody living in Sao Paulo, probably, because I mean, here I had to have surgery at the end of last year, and I literally walked to the hospital. You know, it ended up being emergency surgery. I didn't even know I was going to need it, but I was having problems. I was like, okay, we'll walk down to the hospital. But if I would have still been in Montana, you know, it would have been like at least an hour before I would have been able to get to the hospital, you know. But like, even there's like places like where she lives, like where it would have been much longer, you know. And yeah, it's a totally different reality. I was going to say, you were talking about the way she drives. I don't know if Rodrigo knows this, but there was one time when I was growing up in Montana where we didn't have a speed limit. Well, we had a speed limit. It was called safe and prudent, which basically meant that you could decide what the speed limit should be. Or in practical terms, what it really meant was the highway patrol had to decide. And they would say, like, they'd analyze your car as we drove past. So if you were like driving 100 miles an hour in a Volkswagen Beetle from 1969, then probably that was a little too fast, you know. But it didn't work out very long. Of course, if you ask the Montanans, it wasn't because of the Montana drivers, it was because of all the out-of-staters that just, you know, went crazy. But yeah, I mean, it was the Wild West. But to answer your question about activism, you know, it's funny because, like, for example, when Citizens United happened in the United States, which was this decision that the Federal Supreme Court made that said that corporations could contribute as much money as they wanted to candidates because it was free speech. The Montana Supreme Court actually made a ruling against that, and they tried to make it so that wouldn't be the case in the state. But at the same time, it can be very conservative. My mom is an activist too. I mean, she wasn't really when I was growing up, but well, yes and no. But she's an anti-fracking activist because they've been trying to do hydraulic fracturing, where they basically inject high-speed mixture of chemicals and water into I forgot the technical term, but you know, the rocky layers under the ground to extract natural gas or oil. And a lot of times what happens is the chemicals they use, which they don't reveal because they're proprietary mixtures that they're supposed to be like trade secrets for the companies, get mixed into the water table, and it could contaminate the water that she uses for her organic farm. And the reception between the other farms, between her activities, has been either mixed between people who have supported her or people who have called her like a communist. And it's like, go to Cuba, you know, like, and just like, I think she might have even got some death threats. And she also has like people like watching her from the dirt road and stuff, like in unmarked vehicles, like smoking cigarettes and watching her while she farms and stuff like that. So it's funny. It's kind of split between you know, I kind of split between, I guess, progressive and conservative when it really comes down to it. But you know, me growing up, I think, you know, my family wasn't terribly political when I was growing up, though my mom, she had been in this protracted lawsuit with the largest corporation in the state for because they fired her for some medical issues that she had. And she had one of her best friends was an old union organizer from a mining town, which was at the time one of the richest towns in the country. People didn't know about. A lot of people don't know this, but Butte, Montana, which now people go there to see this huge mining pit that they have. But it was a kind of with the workers' movements in the beginning of the 20th century. It was a big, important area for that. So I grew up listening to her stories about her dad and her growing up, you know, organizing and then my mom fighting this big corporation. And my parents actually were more kind of right of center when I was growing up, like, but that's changed now. But you know, Montana has its own interesting heritage. It's very libertarian in a lot of ways, but not necessarily right-wing libertarian, just kind of libertarian in the, like, you know, I do my thing and you do your thing, and we'll just, you know, we're cool. People doing their own thing, especially on the west side. I don't know. Growing up on the east part in the small towns, it could be a little bit cliquish, you know, like the rural area where I lived in, all the towns were named after families who'd been there for a couple generations. And like, if you weren't there for like 2 or 3 generations, you were considered an outsider, and everybody gossiped about everybody. So that kind of idea of like a small town, everybody being friends and good neighbors, it's not necessarily how it always works out, but it really just depends. I mean, it depends on the town, it depends on the part of the state you're in, and everything. So,
okay.
You know.
Now, tell me about your hometown in a very how can I say? Just use like I'm trying to do with you what I do with my students. Just use 2 or 3 words, 2 or 3 very beautiful adjectives to describe Montana or your town.
Okay. Let me go with Montana, since I grew up in multiple towns there.
Okay.
I'd say big spaces, few people, and lots of cows.
Okay. Big spaces, few people, and lots of cows. Okay. It's like Mato Grosso here in Brazil.
Yeah, it's exactly. That's the comparison that I make.
And what did your parents grow? You said they got a farm and she wanted specialized soil for something specific. What was it? What were they growing? What was their farm of?
Well, I mean, they're still growing stuff there, but what my mom really wanted was an orchard. And it's interesting because most of the farms around there today grow sugar beets and barley for beer and corn. But she knew that the climate and there was something about like the pH balance of the soil would be really good for fruit. And then she found out after she started doing this that about 100 years ago, it used to be all orchards. But also another thing that she grows is hardneck garlic, which is a little bit different from the garlic that you get, say, in Brazil, because the ground has to freeze for it to grow. And it's originally from areas like Siberia and Korea. It tends to be a little bit spicier than, and flavorful than the soft neck garlic, which is what you get in Brazil. And then she grows herbs too. And we grew a lot of potatoes too, which ended up being kind of a pain in the ass because we found out that there's a wild relative of potato that doesn't produce the root like a potato does, but the farmers there brought in a bunch of potato beetles to try to get rid of this weed. And then of course they love potato plants. And then being an organic farm, we used to have to go out there when I was a kid and put on gloves and squish them individually on the
beetles.
Potato
You'd
plants.
have to go grab the beetles and squish them.
Yeah, I was like, it was like I was a beetle mass murderer growing up on this farm. We moved there when I was 13, so I mean I spent my adolescent years there. Yeah. But what she did was a lot of what she focused on for the most part was she grew herbs like basil, oregano, thyme, and then garlic, and she made these like oils, like with garlic and herbs, or salt seasonings, and she named the company. Here's a good one for English students: On Time Gourmet. But the thyme is the herb, so it's like a pun. And of course, Ryan can attest to the flavor of these things because I used to get bucket loads of them and cook with it.
It's amazing.
It was delicious, wasn't it? Unfortunately,
I actually still have a little bit of the salt. I'm like guarding it with my life and spending it on very special meals. It's almost gone, but not quite. Not quite. But we have to take a short break for a moment. Okay. But we'll be right back with some more Tom and telling us some stories about Mexico, Korea, and then giving us a good comparison between his whole life and what he thinks now about living in Brazil. So stick with us and we'll be right back in just a second.
Hello everybody, this is Rodrigo and I'm talking to you from my bedroom where Ryan and Rodrigo Magic happens. I mean the podcast recording of course. It's a reminder to subscribe to our channel. We have a new grammar session, a new discussion session, grammar, present continuous this week, adjectives next week, discussion, politics, COVID-19, Brazil, America, all the horrible and great outcomes we had. So remember to subscribe and watch our all new contents, okay? Thank you guys. Here's a new transition.